My name is Roel van Bueren. In the next 45 minutes I want to show you something about current release of Setup Commander, but also what we have in mind for the next few months to deliver what we have named so far Setup Store to your door. There are a couple of vendors here who tell you things about our store, and we think we're able to use the technology which I will gonna show you to bring this to a next level, that you don't have to go to the store, but things out of the store will be brought to your door. So my name is Roel van Bueren. I work for a small company in the Netherlands, in Delft. One of the things I like when I travel all over the world to visit customers and partners, we have about 50 resellers over the world, in the States and in Canada, is to bring Dutch syrup waffles. These are very popular all over the world. So what we did today is we made sure that every single one coming to this show can get a package of stroopwafels, a package for packagers, a package of these stroopwafels, and you should see the behind the booth. We have a big car with a lot of boxes with these things. So if you want to have an extra box, please make sure you come by at the booth. You know Bob Kelly. He was the guy running appdeploy.com, and a few years ago he moved that to IT Ninja. Bob and I had a beer 5 years ago at in the arena. And I said to Bob, why do I have to go to your website to spend hours and hours finding silent switches for legacy setup types, finding things I have to put in my transform files to switch the auto-update notification off for reader. I said, why not build a tool, kind of a mega tuner or super tool, which has all these silent switches or most silent switches or settings. He said, well, if you want to build something like that, I will gonna help you. Which he did. And 4 years ago, we started with a product which is for the Novell ZENworks space, which is a bundle commander that's shipped by Novell to every single ZENworks customer. And a year later, that was the year of the release of ConfigMgr 2012, we started with a product which is exactly the same, which I'm going to show you in the next 40 minutes, which is called Setup Commander. Who of you has not seen Setup Commander yet? Okay. Setup Commander is the version we have been working with so far. But Raynet came up to us 2 years ago. That's one of our OEM partners. And said, why don't you build an SDK so we can use your technology, your wizards, and your store in our offering too? That's where we started with the Setup Commander components, which is just an SDK for technology partners. I have some examples of something which so far we have called the Setup Commander automation engine, which is based on this SDK and which brings in some automation technology. So that's the next step. The technology partnerships, we closed a deal because Bob was working at Dell a few months ago with Dell. Dell is now shipping for Dell KACE customers a free version of Setup Commander and 19-day version to all Dell KACE customers. Flexera is a very good technology partner. We did a couple of things there. Example giving the integration with the Repackaging Wizard. Gridmetric is helping us out with AppV5 stuff. Microsoft is, because we're a System Center partner, helping us out with SDK stuff to be able to put things in ConfigMgr. I have some samples of that. And Novell is a really loyal customer. Shipping, example giving the Bundle Commander edition. Same goes for RES. We're doing things with RES on the IT store, which will be live in the next few months. VMware, we're helping them out to set up app stacks. And the OEM partnerships are with Liquid. They have a booth in the back. In their offering, you see some component, the setup store. So they use our setup store to help you out to deploy the latest versions of Flash Player and Chrome and Firefox and that sort of stuff. Similar to what SparkleFlow is doing. They don't have a booth this year. They have an application lifecycle management offering where also they use our setup store and the configuration wizards. It started with RayNet. They have a pack commander add-on module for Repack, which is called the pack commander, that's using this technology to be able to access the setup store. On a high level, what do? We try to simplify. Our focus is to do not to work on packaging, but to make sure that an application is deployed to an endpoint as fast and as smooth as possible. We do this using 5 steps. We try to help you out to find the right setup to be able to do an enterprise deployment or whatever software. We all know what bootstrappers are, and probably we all know the disadvantages of bootstrappers. They're quite narcissistic, because you never know what a bootstrapper will do if you launch it. If you have a Visual C++ runtime on your box, you never know whether the bootstrapper will install another version of Visual C++ next to that version, or whether it will come up with an older version. We try to help you out to deal with these kind of things. We also help you out with the analysis of what kind of application are you dealing with. Are you dealing with bootstrappers, with MSI setups, or legacy setups? It's something which I will cover in the demo. And most important part is the configuration part. Whatever we can find to help you out, to get rid of those darn auto-update notification screens, to get rid of Google Chrome adding a task to the scheduler, to auto-update Chrome. That's what we try to do, in the configuration phase. In the Setup Commander 2 version, we have wizards as a service. We don't care which MSI package you want to deploy using MDT or ConfigMgr or RES or KACE or ZENworks. We help you out with as much configuration options for a vendor MSI as possible. And for those setups, which you need to virtualize or which are just crap, there are repackaging options to use RayNet, AppV, Admin Studio, Repackager, Spoon, ThinUp to convert these quickly to a virtual app or an MSI package. And in the last phase, we help you out to come up with this, the best application you can think of in MDT or ConfigMgr or ZENworks. And I will show you in the demo how that works. This is a picture I always like to show. If I look at this screen, and if I ask you how long does it take you on average for those 23 applications to set this up in MDT or ConfigMgr, how long does it take you per app? Who? An hour? 4 hours? A week. Why a week? So for these 23 apps, it takes you a week to set this up in MDT. Anyone can do it quicker? Why can't you do this in 2-3 seconds or 2-3 minutes? What's the difficulty with these Windows setup types? Switches? Anyone else? Testing, that's a very important aspect. So no one is stating anything about packaging. What kind of setup is this, the iTunes setup? Why? How can you tell? Yeah, so you know that this is an archive file, an SFX archive file, and that Apple decided to put an MSI package in this one. Is that the only one? No, in this package. Is there one or are multiple? Prerequisites? Yeah. Yeah. So you have to know how to deal with this setup type. But you were the only one telling that iTunes is, the setup is like this. Yeah. So Java, who can tell me a story about how to deal with Java? What's the difficulty with Java? The setup. What kind of setup is this? How can I determine what kind of setup this is? Are you still there? So this is an exe file. Does this mean that this is an MSI setup? Oh, sorry. Does this mean that this is a non-MSI setup? No, because this is a bootstrapper. There's some logic here which extracts an MSI package, and the logic makes sure that prerequisites are installed on your box. But it's still an MSI package. So if you want to deploy this using ConfigMgr or MDT, what do you need to do? Extract it. Example, yeah. One of the best tricks to know what kind of setup you are dealing with is something which I still have a website, a blog website called MSI Wisdom. If you see such a screen like this, preparing to install, you know that you're dealing with an MSI package. And the beauty of MSI packages is that you can configure this using transform files. Unfortunately, there are only a couple of vendors, Adobe, Smart, and what's the other one, who come up with tooling to be able for you to configure these transform files. Does everybody know what a transform file is? Okay, perfect. So what you have to do every single day, if someone comes up to you with a list like this, is to figure out what kind of application you are dealing with. The non-MSI packages, like VLC player, you need silent switches. If you don't want to repackage this, you need the silent switches. How can you figure out what kind of silent switches are used? Documentation, but most vendors, /? You have to figure out what kind of silent switches are needed. I was fed up dealing with these things, spending so much time, although the time was billable, finding those switches. So with Setup Commander, my goal was to try to see whether I can put as much logic into the Setup Commander product to help you out as much as possible. Some setups are really weird or crappy. I can't help you doing things with these setup types. You then still have to repackage those. But for those vendor MSIs, we can come up with specific settings, like for Evernote, to get rid of auto-updates notification. Why is it important to switch this off, these kind of auto-update notifications? Why should I want to switch this off? Yeah. Yeah, and most of the times they don't have the rights to install the update to begin with. In a VDI, non-persistent VDI environment, seeing an auto-update every time for Java, for Flash Player, for Firefox, for Chrome, that's annoying. So what we try to do is to help you out with this configuration. Let me see, we're going to skip a few screens. Is to come up with wizards which have enough options to deal with these kind of things. These wizards are as a service. We don't really care what kind of MSI you want to deploy using MDT or Configuration Manager. We come up with wizards for every MSI package, and I will show you in a demo how that works. So what I have here is a Windows Server 2012 box. I've used the hydration kit of Johan. Johan, thank you so much for this tool. It's so helpful. To install ConfigMgr 15.11. And I've installed Setup Commander. Let me log in. Here you go. On this machine. Here you go. Setup Commander, you don't need a database, you don't need an infrastructure, you don't need... the only thing you need is the .NET 4 framework to install it. For those of you who are a bit older, I was a big fan in the DOS days of Norton Commander 3.0. I'm still very fond of Total Commander, and that's why I came up with a split screen which looks similar. My thoughts were, if you start it up, gives you the option to connect to Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, or in this case, System Center Configuration Manager. And if I click OK, on the right side of the screen, you see the applications in Config Manager, and there are no applications in Config Manager. That's why this screen is empty. My thinking was, let's try, if you select a setup, and let's pick VLC Player. I have a huge directory structure with different setups. Let me get rid of these two files. My thinking was that if you select a setup, why not go into the setup? Try to do as much analysis as possible to figure out what I'm dealing with. In this case, it's a non-MSI setup file, where we figured out this one was made using NSIS, which is the null soft scriptable install system. Unfortunately, there are only two settings available to do a silent installation of VLC player, but at least it helped you out, try to figure out that this was a non-MSI package, and that these are the silent switches to put it into configuration manager. Now, I was lazy not to put a USC path here, and as you probably know, setting up applications in config manager, you have to start from a UNC path. And this is what took me longer than to talk about this. This is what took me to quickly to select this setup file, to use the right silent switches to put this in config manager. If I go back to my configuration manager here, if I refresh, it took me 10-20 seconds to come up with a first version of an application in config manager with a scripted installation type where the silent switches to deploy VLC player with are brought in. Any questions about this? So the same thing goes if I take this was the 32-bit version, and this is the 64-bit version. Let me get rid of this one. So, new application, and it comes back with a detection script message. I will not bother you with that story, but it brings in the silent switches, so you don't have to look for these silent switches.
Does it also automatically create a detection for the application?
Again?
Does it also automatically create a detection method?
Yeah, what we try to do is to, detection scripts are a pain in the neck if you're working with config manager. So there are a couple of things we try to do to help you out dealing with these legacy setup types. If you really want to use this setup and silent switches, that's fine. But the problem is you have to come up with your own detection method, which means you have to tell config manager, the client running on the machine on which you install VLC player, you have to tell it with a PowerShell script or a VB script, or if file exists on your system to tell that VLC player has been installed. We come up with a VB script which tries to figure out, going into the registry, the uninstall registry hive, to find that piece of software. Yes, yes. We have some clever things there. So a first script dealing with these kind of legacy setups is set up in this application object, and from there you can then tune it. That's one of the things we do. Some other thing we do is that since we know the silent switches, you can of course run the Repackaging Wizard to virtualize or to convert this to an MSI package using Admin Studio or Repack, or some of the virtualization techniques. But we also came up with an MSI wrapper, which takes away completely the whole story about detection scripts, because for MSI setups, we just use the product grid to detect whether an MSI package has already been installed. So we wrap up the legacy setup in an MSI package, and then you can use that to put it into config manager. So that's how we deal with legacy setups. The most funky part is how to deal with MSI packages. So let me show you the example of the Flash player. I have an MSI package of a specific version of Flash player. Now, if I select this one, we go through the list of configuration wizards, which are plugins, or XML documents where per MSI package we have a wizard. Now, this one is quite an extensive wizard, which has settings pre-checked according to best practices, best deployment practices. It makes sense if you deploy Adobe Flash, with Config Manager or with RES or with MDT to switch off the auto-update notification, because then you can manage a Flash player in Configuration Manager. So that's why these checkboxes are already checked. if you want to do additional configuration, all these settings are being saved, and there's a reason. The first reason is that the next time you want to configure Flash Player, and most of the time you have to deal with this every single week, it brings in the last used settings. The second reason is what I will show you with the automation engine. Whatever is possible to, in this case, configure Flash Player, that's brought in using the wizard. The only thing you need to do is to review the settings to decide what you want to do to configure Flash Player. And then the settings are stored in a transform file. And the combination of the MSI package and the changes are brought into one screen, where, again, I didn't start from a UNC path, so the only thing I have to change is this, where we do a couple of things. We read the product name and the version number from the property table to also come up with a consistent naming of, in this case, Flash Player in Configuration Manager. If you're really keen on running the latest versions, which you should, if you're really keen on security-related aspects, then it's wise to come up with a consistent version numbering for your applications in Config Manager. If I click OK, then again, it took me longer to talk about what I'm doing here than setting up the application in Config Manager. Now, for every Adobe product, Adobe Air is over here, we have these plugins, the configuration wizards as a service to help you out to, in this case, prevent installation of untrusted Air apps, prevent automatic updates for Air. And it's like, it's extremely simple. Again, I should change this. It's really simple to select whatever setup you want to configure and put this into Config Manager. Any questions? So the wizards are plugins. Every time you start Setup Commander, every time you start the Setup Store, I will talk about the Setup Store, it checks whether you're running the latest versions of wizards. Let me give you an example. These wizards are on my file system here. So let's say I delete these 4. There's a phone ringing. Here you go. So let's say these 4 configuration wizards are not installed on my system. If I start Setup Commander, it will go out to the web. It will check which configuration wizards are current, what are the latest versions, and if wizards are missing or if newer versions are available on the web, it will automatically download the wizards to my directory where I have configured the wizards to download to. Best practice is not to put it on my local disk, is to put it on a network drive. Because one of the things you could do is then share the wizard settings with your colleagues. If you have multiple instances of Setup Commander running on different admin boxes, if you put this on a share, you can reuse those settings if you want to. Now the manager shows you which wizards we have. Most asked question up to Setup Commander 2 was like, how many wizards do you support? Basically, we don't care. Now we have 205 wizards available, but let me show you an example of an MSI package which I built a few years ago for a local Dutch customer, which is a Greek fonts MSI. This is used at school to install Greek fonts on a Windows box. Setup Commander doesn't have a wizard for this one. And what we do with those vendor MSIs or in-house built MSI packages, within 1 or 2 seconds we generate a first configuration wizard. And with the first version of the wizard, we bring in things like we look for specific public properties to find whether a license key should be installed during the setup. We check for things like database settings. If you have to configure my Microsoft SQL settings during setup, we bring those settings in and add a specific tab to, so you're able to deal with Microsoft SQL settings. So if I auto-generate this wizard, it took 1 second. There's an extra question being asked. The new wizard for Greek fonts has been created and can now be used. So you don't need us to use this, to generate and to use this first configuration wizard. But if you send it back to us, we have an internal tool to go through the wizard and to add specific features. And if the vendor has some documentation on specific public properties, we quickly include those, that information as Ronald, as tooltips and that sort of things. It takes us about 5 or 10 minutes to use our internal tool to update the wizard then, to bump it to a next version, and to give it to the rest of the setup commander user group. So I don't have an email client installed on my system, so I can't send it to support, but that's one of the things you get if you are a customer. So if I say no, it brings in the Greek fonts configuration wizard with all kind of best practices. It makes sense to suppress a reboot example giving, because that's something you want to control out of ConfigMgr or out of MDT. So this is what we mean with as a service, and this is what we mean at supporting unlimited number of MSI packages. Any questions about these configuration wizards? Sure.
Also some question about the Greek fonts. Still, there are some Greek fonts on the disk.
Mm-hmm.
And you will update the Greek fonts mostly because we rebooted to release fonts.
Mm-hmm.
How will do this occasion?
So you mean what the reboot option of the wizard does? It sets the 2 specific public properties to prevent a reboot. Now with fonts, you need to reboot because I think the registration process. Yeah, sure. So what you, although we suppress the reboot, you still have to execute a reboot, but then out of ConfigMgr of MDT to actually fully install the fonts. So you have to still think about whether you want to do so. If you want the setup to execute the reboot, then uncheck it. And if you use ConfigMgr, then it's probably better to use ConfigMgr to reboot your machine. So you still need to reboot it. We do nothing special to for you to install the fonts to actually use it. Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'm sorry?
You don't want to reboot.
Most of the time you don't want to reboot out of the setup. That's why the setting is always checked. Yeah. So over the years, I got questions like, hey Roel, that's cool that you have the Flash player and the MSI package for Flash player, but where do I download this? In the first slide with the 5 steps, I told you we're helping you the first step, selecting the right setup. This is where the setup store, how the setup store was born. The setup store is something, if you start it up, loads a current list of setups in our store. It's a list of about 2,000 setup types, 15 languages for Firefox, the Chrome Business Edition, Flash Player, Notepad++, WinSCP. Basically every piece of software we have seen people want to deploy on their Windows boxes. But there's a request setup feature where you as a partner or a customer can ask us, can you make sure that this piece of software is added to the setup store? What?
If I put in a request, how long?
Within a day. Within a day. There are a couple of things we do then. At first we try to check whether the vendor comes up with information either on a website or Twitter or whatever that they have released a newer version. We have a scanner running in the office where every half an hour it checks multiple sources to figure out whether there's a new Chrome or a new Firefox or a new Java. Or most of the time Adobe releases Flash Player in the middle of the night for us in our time zone at 4 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, we have the setup in the setup store. So for you, if you come in the office, then you have the latest player, the latest version of the player. There are a couple of, let me resize the screen. There are a couple of columns here where this is a 1969, that's the number of entries. There are a couple of things which you can do in this setup store. You can, example giving, filter the list for, give me all setups which have been added or updated in the setup store this week. So this week, we have seen a new 7-zip version. We have seen a new front motion version. That's an MSI package for Firefox, where Firefox has a group policy plugin to be able to manage Firefox out of group policies. As you see, we have multiple versions, and if there's a language missing, it's for us easy to add it both to the scanner as well as to the setup store. If you double-click on a setup, we don't host this stuff. Most of the vendors don't like us or other partners to host these setups. So we show, if you double-click, where we download the setup files from. And we also maintain these download links. We make sure every day that these links are valid and stay valid. It's easy to select one or multiple setups from the setup store and then in batch download this to your local drive or to your network drive. So this is how we make sure every day that you're able to fetch the latest legacy setups or MSI setups from the setup store. Example giving, Citrix has gotomeeting.zip. iTunes has the iTunes.exe file, which is just a zip file, which has some MSIs to install iTunes with. We have a processor which takes care of extracting the zip file, which takes care of extracting the ISO file, which takes care of whatever needs to be done first with a bootstrapper or a zip file to be able to select the core setup to then use that setup to configure it using a wizard and then to put it in ConfigMgr. That's all kind of things we try to do with the setup store. So if I search, you can search for different fields. Example giving for Flash Player. Then you see that I have the plugin version for the Flash Player, but I don't have the ActiveX version. I can easily download it from the setup store. And out of the setup store, I can quickly create an application in ConfigMgr to, here you go, the same wizard with the same settings I've used the last time I picked Flash Player. I only have to change the path here, and then I can put it in ConfigMgr. So if I close this one up, it refreshes the list on this side, and if I refresh the list over here, sometimes I have to go back and forth. Here you go, I have the application installed. Question?
For example,
You can say it in Dutch. Yeah.
is it creating multiple lines with parameters?
So what it does in case of iTunes, I think I have iTunes here. It extracts out of the setup.exe the different MSI packages you have here. So this is the core setup. And iTunes is quite funky because there are a lot of options to configure iTunes. There's a parental control flag, which needs to be set in the registry key. And we bring in all the information to do so, also with some tooltips and some links back to the Apple website, so we're able to configure this. There's a link to a knowledge base article. This MSI needs prerequisites. If you click on this link, you go to one of the knowledge base articles, which tells you what's needed to set up iTunes in Configuration Manager.
Would you make one rule or more?
We select one setup per application, and then you have to do the logic to install the prerequisites first and then to install the core. We can, but so far we try to do it in an object-oriented way, because if you put it in one application, QuickTime also has some dependencies of one of the components, and it's so cool to just to come up with one prerequisite and then to share it with, example, giving QuickTime and iTunes also. Yeah, it's just a way of. Sure.
I'm just trying to understand in
Any application.
For line of business stuff, I mean, so how would this tool benefit you in this day-to-day scenario? You've got 100 packages to get through. You don't know what they are. It's a mixture of complexities. Because what I'm seeing at the moment is obviously iTunes and these are sort of well-known applications.
Mm-hmm.
Will this be able to handle stuff that's not necessarily in the canon?
Yeah. So I never start with the setup store because people always tend to think that we only support 2,000 applications which are in the setup store. The setup store is only a convenient feature to grab the specific latest versions of things which are in the setup store. And although you can ask us to add specific pieces of software which are not in the setup store, you still have to deal with line of business apps or add apps which are not used by other companies or partners or customers. That's why we have brought in the as a service infrastructure for the wizards. We don't really care what kind of MSI package you pick. We auto-generate a wizard if it's not there, which you can send back to us, and then we can help you out enhancing the wizard, or you can just reuse one of the wizards which is already there. So we thought of adding an option to Setup Commander just to point to a directory where you have all your line of business applications, and then to auto-generate, let's say you have 500 apps there, to auto-generate the wizards for those 500 apps, which takes about a minute or so. But so the answer is yes. Yeah. Any other questions? So one of the things which is in my slide deck, Office 365 example, Kim, is a nightmare to configure, as you probably know. It's quite weird that the Office team came up with this MSI infrastructure, the MSI technology, but with Office 365 they came up with some weird way. AppV? Yeah. So what we did, I think it's in the slide deck, we came up with a wizard where hopefully I can find it. There's a specific wizard for Office 365, which helps you to configure the XML files, both to download the setup files as well as to install Office 365. We have a couple of configuration wizards for non-MSI packages, and the Office 365 configuration wizard is one of them. 2016 is just built in. If you start setup/x/admin, then you can build in the configuration wizard. So there's no need for us to build something which Microsoft already built. So one of the things I want to tell you is this. We also added telemetric to the setup store. So we're able to track which are the most popular setups people download from the setup store to be able to enhance the wizard with specific settings. And the Flash player, both the ActiveX as well as the plugin one, these are very popular setup types. So we make sure that we test the Flash player stuff every single time Adobe comes up with a new Flash player. I only have 5 minutes left, and there's some really cool stuff which I want to show you. Our customers have used Setup Commander for years and Bundle Commander to do every day, every week, exactly the same thing. Grabbing a setup from the setup store, a latest version, to configure it with the wizards, and then to put it into ConfigMgr or ZENworks or Dell KACE. That's cool, but it's very repetitive work, very boring work. So what we're working on is something which is not ready yet, but the core parts are still there, are there, is we have made an automation engine where you can set up what's called a subscription. I have 2 subscriptions here for marketing department and for the sales department. And let me show you how this for marketing works. And this is what I already have downloaded. And where there's no graphical user interface for this one yet, but in the subscription file you define which products you want us or the service to check for the latest versions. In this subscription I've configured Flash Player, and what the subscription does is if I start the setup store, which is a service, but I started in a GUI now, otherwise I have nothing to show to you. It will load the list of wizards, so it makes sure that the latest collections of wizards are available on my system. It goes into the setup store, it checks for the latest version of Flash Player. It uses the configuration wizard which I've showed you for Flash Player. It sets up the transform file, and if my connector for System Center is running on this box, it will make sure that these applications, the MSI packages and the transform files, are quickly set up in Configuration Manager. So what happens behind the screens in this directory is that while this server is running, it's filling up with subdirectories, 5 minutes, thank you, with the setup files for 7-zip and Flash Player. So in the 7-zip directory, you see a transform file, a notifications file, because I've configured the connector to send me an email that there's a new Flash Player. So it sends an email to my mailbox that, hey, there's a new Flash Player, I've downloaded it for you. And in this case, in the subscription file, have enabled ZCM and SCCM. It should be the other way around. Some funky logo here. So it tells me, sending an email that it has downloaded and configured the apps. And then the connector to System Center is making sure that if I refresh the list here, it's empty. It's setting up the application objects of the stuff which has been downloaded by the setup store servers. So the same settings which I configured manually in setup commander 2 have now been brought in by the setup store service engine. Is this cool? Can you give me some feedback on what you think if you see this for the first time? Because this is brand new stuff. Fred.
About the
Yep.
Well, I did a previous question. How do you manage to present the application to you in a controlled manner?
So question is, how can I present the...
How do you present all the application to the user in a controlled manner?
What be the end user or the administrator? I don't understand the question.
I think it's the same part. Well, all the applications you deploy
With ConfigMgr?
yes.
Oh, okay. So that's a totally different... With ConfigMgr, there's no user interface apart from the software center where you can fire off the actual setup. But there's no managed shortcut system like ZENworks has and Liquid has and some other partners. Yeah, so that's not a real setup commander question, but it's more of a ConfigMgr question. Other questions about the engine?
I think, for me, certainly, the automation is fantastic, but obviously there's still a bit of human interaction needed through the naming standards. Is that something you
Yeah. So Marcel is working for a service provider, and Marcel came up with a question which is really really similar. We don't really care about the structure of the directory in which we download the setups. So this is a default naming convention where we use the manufacturer name, the product name, and the version number. But it's up to you to define whether you want to have Adobe and then all the Adobe products in a subfolder and maybe a language, maybe whatever. And that's something which is configurable with the engine also. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a really good question. It's multi-tenant, so if you are a service provider, you can use this to download this example giving on an Azure box and have used the connectors either on-premise or in the cloud to use the connector to System Center to actually set up the applications in a local config manager environment. So, any other questions, sir?
The convert option by MSI to AppManagEvent, you need to have some other parts to do that.
Of course, yeah. Either from Raynet, Flexera, or other partners too, or the Microsoft sequencer to be able to make the conversion. Yeah.
Adobe also goes to the cloud and also has an own packaging tool.
Yeah.
I have tried that, but there are some options in there that I don't want to use or they are not available to set up with the packaging tool. Are you having any ideas?
Yes, I have. I can talk for 4 hours about this topic alone. Yeah, yeah. Maybe I should do a session next year on Adobe products. Let's do this one offline, and then we can tell you about some practical tips. Any other questions? Because I'm running short on time.
This is, if I implement this, it makes me completely dependent on you, your company.
Mm-hmm. For what?
For keeping up the things.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any guarantee you will be still there? I mean?
I hope so. I hope so. So, just to give you an example, how long we have been doing this. Every week we send out a newsletter which has the latest updates of things we put in the setup store. This is over only 1 week, a list of things we have added in the setup store. We are a team of 4 people, so it's not a one-man show thing. We're very consistent in updating the store. We have written some scanner tools to auto-update the store, but also to have some test plan to semi-auto-update the store, that some of the group has to officially approve a setup of being added to the setup store. So we make sure that it's a consistent thing. That's the only thing I can say as an answer. One last question about the engine. So you like this stuff? Feel free to ask me any questions about this automation stuff. This is brand new. I was happy that it didn't blow up. I'm very excited to... the schedule is that we want to release this somewhere during Q1 next year or so. So thank you for your time and enjoy the syrup waffles.